So this is the PowerPoint that I chose for this assignment. It's called Adding Fractions, and I didn't choose to revise this slide. However, when you look at this title slide, there's a lot going on, and one of the ideas within this chapter is that you should not really have a lot of extra images or text that really don't serve any purpose and that don't relate to the content of the slide. And so this background image does not at all relate to the content. The entire presentation follows this theme. I guess it's an ultimate challenge theme. Or something, maybe a cartoon I'm not familiar with. And so this slide is a perfect example. In the text, they say that these images might gain the viewer's attention, but it doesn't really serve any educational value or really any value whatsoever. This is the first original slide that I chose to revise, and my revision is following this. But one thing that stood out to me with this slide was, again, all of the extra images that really don't serve any purpose at all to this presentation. There is that interesting monster thing in the left-hand side that again follows along with the theme that this presentation author was trying to use. However, it really has no value with regards to adding fractions with unlike denominators. The background and all of these images, especially the lines that are sticking out around the perimeter of the box, can really be very distracting to the viewer. And that's actually something that was mentioned in the text, that these extra graphics can be distracting and they can really disrupt the learning process. And so I know when I see this slide, I am right away just very overwhelmed. And there's a lot of information that's coming out at me that, some of which I don't really need to know. And so I chose to revise this slide, which I made it look like this. I left a lot of the content the same. I did revise the title. I don't know where this slide is used, whether it's used within the United States or somewhere else that might call fractions different names. I know fractions with unlike denominators can be called different things throughout the country and throughout the world. So I'm used to calling it unlike denominators. So that's why if you look at the original slide, it says, how do we add dissimilar fraction, which is grammatically incorrect to begin with. So I changed it to, how do we add fractions with unlike denominators? I then used the Microsoft PowerPoint math symbols to rewrite the fractions 1/2 and 1/3. If we go back to the original slide, it looks very inconsistent. The 1/3 is clearly just typing the 1/3, and the 1/2 looks more like an actual fraction. So I wanted it to look consistent. I think it's easier to visualize those numbers as fractions if they appear the way that we write fractions. So I changed that, and then instead of doing equals n, I did equals question mark, or an equals line is what I've done when I've taught adding fractions. I just think overall that equation looks a lot friendlier and prettier, so to speak, than the original fraction. Now, if you look at the actual content of the slide, in the original slide, first off, the word step 2 is partly covered by that red monster thing. And it says, follow the same step in adding similar fraction, which again is not grammatically correct. But then it goes to say, add the numerators, copy the same denominator. It has an example of the equation, and then it has the answer. So I actually, when I revised this slide, I did follow the same sort of rule. However, I wrote it A, so it is grammatically correct, and B, the text is a lot bigger, and because it's in a box in the center of the slide, I really think it calls the viewer's attention. And so I wrote, once each fraction has a common denominator, you can add the numerator. The denominator will remain the same. And then instead of typing the fractions 3-6 plus 2-6 equals 5, or slash 6, I mean, I chose to get images. That way you can really see these fractions the way that you would write them if you were writing them with a pencil and paper. And then what I did, just to add a little bit more visual elements to this slide, is I added a chart that I divided or partitioned into 6 equal parts. I shaded 3 of them red to equal the 3/6, 2 of them yellow to equal the 2/6, and then that way, if you're using this in the classroom, you could point out the 3/6, then you can count those. You can point out the 2/6, and then you can count those, and then you can count the total to show that 3/6 plus 2/6 equals 5/6. This is the second slide that I chose to revise from the original PowerPoint. It came at the end of the presentation, and it served as sort of a formative assessment with adding fractions, both with like and with unlike denominators. However, if you look, this slide is extremely busy, and I believe it violates the coherence principle. Again, that background image not only has nothing to do with adding fractions, however, it also takes away from actually seeing the fractions. You can't even really see this 5/4 plus 1/4 over here. And so I chose to revise it to make it a little less busy, or a lot less busy, and to really, to not take away from the actual purpose of the slide, which is to assess students' ability to add these fractions. I also added some directions just for clarification purposes. And so this is the slide, or my version of this slide. Oh, I forgot about these. Yeah, these random images also that pop up when you try and navigate through the slide, which again serves no educational purpose and makes the slide even more busy than it originally was. I chose to revise it this way. It's very simple, but it does what it needs to do. As I said earlier, added some more directions. I just wrote, be sure to show your work, just to make sure there wasn't any questions. You have some students that will just add them in their heads and say, I'm done, without really showing you at all how they reached an answer. I have no background image because a background image serves no purpose. I also used Microsoft Equation to write these equations. That way the fractions actually look like fractions. And I made 6 of them, all in 2 equal columns, just for an aesthetically pleasing look. And so this is how I revised this presentation. I do think my version does follow the coherence principle. There aren't any extra images or music or background images or anything extra like that. It really calls the viewer's attention to what is important within the presentation.